Hello students, welcome to our first screencast of the semester. At this time, I would like you to open a Google Doc, title it Week 8, Masculinity and Peacebuilding, and share the Google Doc with me, zenob@tcnj.edu. Please give me commenting rights so we can have a conversation about your answers. Before we begin, I would like you to also read this article written by the comedian Michael Ian Black. And I would like you to write these questions in that Google Doc, and I would like you to answer them for me. This week, we're going to be talking about masculinity and peacebuilding, and we're also going to be looking at sexual and gender-based violence from the week before our spring break. Our presenters did a fabulous job. I'm just adding a couple more things to the information that they had already given you. So firstly, let's look at the definition of sexual and gender-based violence. It refers to any act that is perpetrated against a person's will and is based on gender norms and unequal power relationships. It's a violation of human rights. It's largely rooted in individual attitudes that condone violence within the family, the community, or the state. And it's been both the cause of forced displacement and a terrible consequence of the breakdown of family and community structures that accompany it. There are 5 different types of sexual and gender-based violence. There's sexual violence, which we're not going to talk about because our group went into it quite extensively before break. Physical violence, same reason. Emotional and psychological violence, harmful traditional practices, and socioeconomic violence. I would like to talk to you a little bit about emotional and psychological violence. Just a reminder, if you're not sure what that is, it's abuse or humiliation. It's non-sexual verbal abuse that's insulting, degrading, demeaning, compelling the victim to engage in humiliating acts. It also includes confinement. Harmful traditional practices have many different subcomponents, the first being female genital mutilation. Second being early marriage, when there's arranged marriage for under the legal age of consent. Forced marriage, which is arranged marriages that the victim that goes against the victim's wishes. Honor killings and maimings, which would be maiming or murdering a man or woman as a punishment for acts considered inappropriate with regard to his or her gender, and believing that they brought shame on the family or community. Infanticide or neglect, and the denial of education for girls or women. And finally, socioeconomic violence is the discrimination and or denial of opportunities, services, the exclusion, denial of access to education, health assistance, employment, or denial of property rights based on gender. There are several causes of sexual and gender-based violence against women. These factors go from the bottom up. So we're going to talk about individuals first. So individuals who were abused as a child, witnessed marital violence, had an absent or rejecting father, or saw the frequent use of alcohol growing up, would be more susceptible to causing sexual gender-based violence, but not in all cases, only in a few. At the family level, males controlled the wealth and decision-making within the family. And marital conflict is also seen as a strong predicator of abuse. At the community level, women's isolation or lack of social support, together with male peer groups that condone or legitimize men's violence, predict higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence. And at the societal level, violence against women is most common where gender roles are rigidly defined and enforced, and where the concept of masculinity is linked to toughness, male honor, or dominance. This includes cultural norms, which is the tolerance of physical punishment of women and children. This is acceptable means of violence to settle disputes, and the perception that men have ownership of women. So the justification of violence evolves from gender norms, the proper roles and responsibilities of men and women. Many cultures hold that men have the right to control their wives' behavior and that women who challenge that right must be punished. So this includes examples in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Nicaragua, Tanzania, Zimbabwe. There are studies that find that violence is frequently viewed as a physical chastisement, and it's the husband's right to correct his wife. As a result, there are several costs of sexual and gender-based violence. one of them being human rights. So violence against women is the most pervasive yet least recognized human rights violation in the world. It causes health problems, including chronic pain, physical disability, drug and alcohol abuse, and depression. And there are economic costs as well. Survivors of sexual and gender-based violence not only have reduced short-term income potential, they also have immediate and long-term medical expenses, and their injuries sometimes reduce long-term income and productivity. As mentioned by our group last week, or 2 weeks ago, talked about sexual and gender-based violence in the Republic of the Congo. Sexual and gender-based violence has a direct correlation to conflict. So wartime sexual gender-based violence fuels displacement, weakens governments, destabilizes communities, and inhibits post-conflict reconciliation and imperils long-term stability. The World Bank indicates that levels of sexual violence may escalate during conflict and that the effects can persist long after the formal conflict has ended. And global estimates say that about 35% of women have experienced physical violence in their lifetime, but in conflict-affected countries, these rates are higher. And as demonstrated by our group, over 40% of women in the Democratic Republic of the Congo have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. So why does this happen in conflict? Violence is normalized, and sexualized violence is often used to punish and terrorize populations, fuel displacement, and destroy the fabric of communities, as indicated by our presentation. Sexual violence against civilians is a common form of human rights violations, and rape is used as a systematic weapon of warfare to torture and humiliate victims and their families, and to destroy the community and demoralize the enemy. Okay. Very important, sexual and gender-based violence is always an act of domination, grounded in cultural perceptions of what constitutes identities of masculinity and femininity. And in post-world integration, oftentimes survivors of violence often face significant difficulties accessing resources necessary to reintegrate into society, as we saw in the examples given in the Congo. And they often face stigmas which often lead to victims staying silent. This started to change, however, in the 1990s, although it's the 1990s, which is crazy to me considering our human history. In 1998, the International Criminal Court recognized rape as a war crime, which is an important step towards fighting the impunity of sexual violence in armed conflicts. What I would like you to do now is take a moment and watch this very brief video on Bosnia's rape camps. So I would like you to have your Google Doc open as well. And I want you to give a timestamp of where you found the information or what inspired your answer. So while you're watching the video, you need to answer these questions that you see here on the screen. And then I would like you to put a timestamp of where you found the information. There are several steps that can be taken to prevent sexual and gender-based violence. Advocacy is one. So for over the last 2 decades, women's advocacy groups around the world have been working to draw more attention to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse of women and to stress the need for action. One of the reasons why we're actually talking about it in class today. Protection has been provided for abused women, for example, shelters. Legal action, groups have lobbied for legal reforms, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides. Constructivism. Constructivism is challenging the norms of the day, what we consider norms or our principles or our beliefs. So groups have challenged the widespread attitudes and beliefs that support violent behavior against women, and also engaging men as allies to change these social norms. Education is also a critical step for overcoming the power dynamics and inequality that fosters conditions in which gender-based violence occurs. Learning about legal rights can shift social norms and deter perpetrators of violence and increase women's confidence to raise their voices about critical issues. And institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations have stepped up to bring about projects that prevent sexual and gender-based violence as well. As I mentioned before, there's a legal framework now in place to protect against sexual and gender-based violence. So as you can see on the screen here, there are several different laws that are put in place to stop sexual and gender-based violence. I'm only going to go through a couple of them. The first one is CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Is commonly referred to as the International Bill of Women's Rights. In 1992, CEDAW Monitoring Committee expressed an official interpretation of violence against women as a form of discrimination, and they adopted key strategic objectives to prevent and eliminate any form of sexual and gender-based violence. We just talked about the statute of the International Criminal Court, which recognizes rape and other forms of sexual violence as war crimes when committed in armed conflict. But as we stated in our last class together, and was so eloquently put by the people who gave the presentation, really local support for victims of sexual and gender-based violence is perhaps the strongest way to begin peace building and to stop the stigmas. So it starts with a focal person in the community. Because of shame and fear, rape survivors often do not seek help, but have to be offered support proactively. So a system that reaches out to women is vital, and focal persons should be identified in the communities. Keep in mind that these women should also work with other people in need. And the focal person in the community should have the capacity for empathy with women who are rejected by society and the confidence that's required to successfully negotiate with family and community. There should be spaces where women can speak about their experience. And most importantly, we need outreach for men. Men are affected by sexual and gender-based violence directly as victims or indirectly as husbands or fathers of women who were raped or as perpetrators. So this is very important to get them involved because it includes all the community so that shame goes away. Sensitization and awareness, which is addressing social taboos, starting with a community dialogue about gender relations and violence to remove the stigma. And of course, justice. Justice for victims acknowledges publicly the harm that the survivor has experienced and contributes to the rehabilitation process. But as we talked about in the last class, the legal systems in war-torn societies have many flaws. They cannot offer security or protection for the victims, and prosecution may expose the person to further humiliation or re-victimization. And often the chances that perpetrators will actually be convicted and victims receive compensation are slim. So with all this in mind, let's now move to masculinity and peace building. What I would like you to do is I would like you to watch this brief video called Men, Peace, and Security, Agents of Change. And using your Google form, I would like you to write down the questions that you see on the right side. What do these experts propose as solutions for men to unlearn violence? What surprised you about the video? Okay, I would like you to give a timestamp of where you found your information or what inspired your answer as well. Let's just go back and review a couple of key terms when we're looking at masculinity and peace building. The first being gender. So the definition of gender is thus. It refers to the characteristics and behaviors that a society or culture associates with males and females. The terms masculine and feminine are usually used to describe gender. The definition of gender identity is an individual's deeply held sense of being male, female, or another gender. This is separate from biological sex. And finally, gender expression is defined as the way we show our gender to the world. Societal expectations of gender expression are reinforced in almost every area of life. Even very young children are clear about the gender choices that boys and girls are, quote, supposed to make in relation to toys, colors, clothes, games, and activities. So let's look at what is masculinity. Okay. Because femininities and masculinities are gender identities, they are shaped by sociocultural processes and not by biology. Femininities and masculinities are plural and dynamic. They change with the culture and with individuals. Femininities and masculinities are plural. There are many forms of femininity and many forms of masculinity. What gets defined as masculine or feminine differs by region, religion, class, national culture, and other social factors. How femininities and masculinities are valued differs culturally. So cultural notions of feminine and masculine behavior are shaped in part by observations of what women and men do. So remember, these ideas are learned. Messages about feminine and masculine behaviors are embedded in our advertising, the media, the news, educational materials, and so forth. These messages are present in a range of environments, from the home to the workplace to public spaces. And from any age, little boys learn that they're expected to be tough at all times. And I know that we are not there right now, but gentlemen, I would like you to answer this question in your Google Doc. What were the gender expectations for you growing up? Were you expected to be tough? So please answer that in your Google Doc. As socially constructed identities, boys and men learn appropriate gender roles in accordance to the masculine expectations of their given society. This means that from a very early age, boys get messages of what it means to be boys. And often they are punished if they deviate. Okay, so if they don't meet the expectations of what it means to be a man, they're often called homophobic or feminizing slurs. And these degradations work to police the boundaries of what's acceptable for behavior or appearance for boys and men, which is one explanation as to why gender roles in our society are rigidly defined and vigilantly enforced. All men are influenced by their upbringing, experience, and social environments, which play a big role in determining one's view of masculinity and manhood. This means that masculinity is going to be different for everyone. Some particularly influential factors in shaping one's idea of manhood are race, class, ability, sexual orientation, and gender, and culture. So, for example, in our culture, little boys learn that they're expected to be tough at all times. They learn that the only acceptable emotion they can show without fear of ridicule is anger. They learn to solve problems and express their frustration with their fists or by playing rough with other little boys. They learn that just because of their gender, they need to bottle up their emotions or just deal with their issues. So here are some statistics that I thought would be interesting for us to look at. Overall, globally, men's life expectancy is lower than that of women. Men have more accidents, they fill prisons and top criminal statistics, and are the ones who almost exclusively take decisions that lead to armed conflict and war. Average figures from Europe, the US, and Australia have shown that men stand charged for between 80 and 90% of all violent crimes. Not only is male violence directed toward women, statistics show that men are more than often than not victims of other men's violence. And 1 in 6 men will be sexually assaulted in their lives, typically before the age of 14, oftentimes by other men. In private life, too, men are more likely to be armed and violent. In the United States, private gun ownership runs 4 times higher among men than among women, even after a campaign by the gun industry to persuade women to buy guns. Body contact sports such as boxing and football involve ritualized combat and often physical injury, and these sports are almost exclusively practiced by men. Dangerous driving is increasingly recognized as a form of violence. It is mainly done by young men, and young men die on the roads at the rate 4 times that of young women and kill at even a higher ratio. Elder men, as corporate executives, make decisions that result in injury or death from the actions of their businesses, industrial injuries to the workers, pollution injury to neighbors, and environmental destruction. So sorry for all the bad news. And this is not a reflection of the gentlemen in our class. These are overall global statistics. Okay, but an analysis of masculinity remains largely absent in political, policy, and media communities that come together around war. Mainly men are responsible for the horrors of war. The cultures and institutions that prepare for and deliver armed violence on behalf of the state or non-state actors are predominantly constructed by men, led by men, and filled with men. Yet, as there are today, with women fighters at the front line, senior women military strategists and women heads of state also take their countries into war, but not as much as men. Still, there's evidence that tells us it's mainly men who organize and deliver violence. And as we talked about the last class, suffering, on the other hand, is stereotyped as largely female today, with a foregrounding of the pain of women and children. But we should also keep in mind that men suffer terribly in war as well, and many resist the mainly male violence of a conflict, and nonviolently support the rescue and survival of their families. Research also indicates that military cultures tend to foster attitudes that are demeaning to women through training, violence, and sexist language, images, jokes, drill chants, and songs. The world military expenditure is estimated to be at $1,686 billion in 2016. $1,686 billion is the world military expenditure. 30 million members of the world's armed forces are men, mostly men, I should say. In many countries, all soldiers are men, and even in those countries that admit women to the military, commanders are almost exclusively men. Men dominate other branches of enforcement, both in the public sector as police officers and prison guards, and in the private sector as security agents. So we have a problem with masculinity and violence throughout all of our institutions, which is reinforced over and over. Although I have to say in the last 10 to 20 years, we're seeing more of an acceptance of different forms of gender identity, but we still have a long way to go. I asked you to read Hannah Wright's Masculinity, Conflict, and Peacebuilding for the lecture. And she looks at the dynamics of masculinity and violence in her report. And she observes that gender roles often incite men to participate in violence in attempts to improve masculinity. So I want to focus on a couple of points that she speaks to. First, very important, Wright states that, and I'm quoting from the article, "It has been noted in a range of contexts that the concentration of development programming on women's empowerment have left men feeling excluded." So I want to say that again. It's been noted in a range of contexts that the concentration of development programs on women's empowerment have left men feeling excluded and their masculinity threatened, which has created tensions within families and communities and may have led to an increase in violence against women. And this is my opinion as well. I think I grew up in a time with the rise of feminism. And during that time, I've constantly gotten messages that I can be anything, I can do anything. And I often feel that, just like Michael Ian Black's article, that I haven't seen this empowerment of men. Even though there's already lots of men in power, I understand the yin and yang of this, the empowerment of women, but now we're seeing a backlash because of the empowerment of women. We're seeing men being left behind. So I think Michael Ian Black's article speaks to this resentment as well. Hannah Wright talks about women and masculinity, and she says that women also put pressure on men to commit violence, and thereby reinforcing the dominant conceptions of violent masculinity, which complement ideas of passive femininity. Okay? And so I thought that was important for us to look at, because she's looking at the possibility of women also propping up these ideas of what it means to be masculine. Okay. So how do we fix this? We're going to look at some strategies that are used to transform masculinity. The first being group education strategies. Okay. These are efforts undertaken to bring men together in formal and semi-formal settings in order to implement training activities of different types, such as courses, workshops, and seminars. Okay. Fundamental issues that are addressed at these group education workshops is the social construction of masculinity, the sexual division of work, masculinity's power and violence, masculinity and sexuality, and responsible fatherhood. So these group activities stimulate in-depth reflection and analysis, and to engage men emotionally as well as rationally. And participants are encouraged to identify and examine their own attitudes, values, and behaviors, and understand that how they can uphold patriarchal norms and propose strategies for change, which begin with making change in their own lives. Okay. In an evaluation of these kinds of programs to transform men's attitudes towards gender-based violence, the International Rescue Committee found that it was also important to work with women to challenge gender norms that they have internalized, which justify discrimination and violence against them. The second way to transform masculinity is community outreach strategies. So we're going from the bottom up, from individuals up to the community. These are activities aimed at influencing culturally ingrained attitudes, values, and behaviors on a wider scale, including mass media campaigns, distribution of educational informational materials, rallies, marches, cultural events, including theater, the training of activists to reach other men, and organized community activities. Similarly, some use particularly influential men, such as celebrities or sports personalities or political leaders in their media, to garner more attention and position them as role models. Projects will include high-quality media such as commercials, soap operas, television dramas, produced by commercial studios with professional actors and technicians. And finally, integrated strategies. These programs use a combination of group education and community outreach strategies in mutually complementary ways. Evidence suggests that these programs, which integrate group education with community outreach and mass media campaigns, are the most effective ways at changing masculine behavior. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a case study, Colombia. We're going to look at Colombia now. So I'd like you to watch this video from The Economist. You're going to answer these questions that you see here and put a timestamp of where you found the information in the video. So I want you to tell me, who are the FARC? How did they not found the conflict, I should say fund the conflict? So how did they get the money for it? Why did peace fail initially? And why is peace succeeding now? Okay, so I'd like you to take a moment to watch that. So pause my screencast. I would also like you to look at this HBO Vice News video about Colombia. Again, answer these questions and use the timestamp when in the video you found your information. What is your perception of the FARC gaining political power in Colombia? Should the FARC be given political legitimacy? And how does this connect to masculinity and peace building? Again, I need you to timestamp where you got your information or where your opinions were influenced. I also asked you to read this week Kimberly Thadon's Reconstructing Masculinities. So the point of her article is that successful reintegration of FARC rebels not only requires fusing the processes and goals of DDR programs with transitional justice measures, but that DDR and transitional justice requires a gendered analysis that includes an examination of the links between weapons, masculinity, and violence. So just to review, DDR stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Combatants must lay down all their weapons, governments must end the conflict, and communities must receive or reject demobilized fighters. In the article, Thadon talked to men and boys about masculinity and being part of the culture in Colombia. And so there's a constant reinforcement of masculinity. So she had one young man say that, quote, "Everyone treats me with respect. It's not like it was before. When I walk down the street, people move out of my way. Now I can send my mom 350,000 pesos a month, and she's doing all right now. I even saved up and bought my mom a house." She also talked to this guy named Vladimiro. He finished his military service in Colombia only to return to his poor neighborhood and into a labor market where he was just another unemployed young man. So in Colombia, they have this idea of militarized masculinities, which is the fusion of certain practices and images of maleness with the use of weapons, the exercise of violence, and the performance of aggressive and frequently misogynist masculinity. Okay. So, for example, there's a talk of a man who puts on his military face during an interview, and as a result of being trained in this military face, they're often not able to get jobs because they look menacing and intimidating. Okay? And then you have paramilitaries who join the AUC, fostered a feeling of pride. So, quoted from the article, to feel like a big man in the streets of their barrios, to go out with the prettiest women, to dress well, there are privileges. So women uphold this idea of what it is to be masculine as well, and promote it. In this culture, guns are a threat and a source of security in this highly violent environment. So laying down weapons and trusting the police to protect them diminishes men's capacity to protect their families in the event that armed actors come for them. So here's the big problem. Former combatants in Colombia have little access to civilian symbols of masculine prestige. Militarized masculinity produces a male that is only marketable in conflict. And both men and women in this culture promote these violent masculine stereotypes in an effort to survive or thrive. But the downside of this is, in this culture, women take on strong masculine men by selling themselves to them. They seek out these men because they're looking for security. Yet a common phenomenon in these relationships is domestic violence. So Thanon also looks at the problems with DDR programs as well. And she says that they are squarely located within a military security framework. The focus failed to give consideration to host communities and the need to consider local, cultural, or gendered conceptions of what constitutes rehabilitation and resocialization of ex-combatants. So she recommends opening spaces for alternative masculinities, addressing the attitudes and behavior that these former combatants have learned, and bringing conscious awareness to the gendered patterns of thought and conduct. All right, the last thing that I would like you to do is I'd like you to watch this case study on Ireland. Again, it's a short video. I want you to look at the indoctrination of boys into the hatred of the other. Okay, so I want you to put a timestamp for where you found the information as well. So what are your observations of the boys in this video, and what surprised you? Okay, this is taking place after the Troubles. The Troubles was the civil war in Ireland, which were the Catholics versus the Protestants, although it was much deeper than that. That was just the identarism portion of this. So I'd like you to watch this and tell me your thoughts about the boys in the video. Next week, we're going to be looking at nonviolent action, and there are 3 things that I want you to look at. The first one is Robert Johansson's Radical Islam and Nonviolence, a case study of religious empowerment and constraint among the Pashtuns. Okay? While you're reading this is what I want you to think about. So not we, but globally there's a stereotype that Islam is considered a violent religion. So in this article, you're going to read about a group of people in the Pashtun who were considered to be the most brutal people on the planet, but they used nonviolence to thwart British colonialists. And we don't hear about them, so I would like you to read about them and then tell me about them in your reading memo. Kirkshaw's Nonviolent Action and Its Misconceptions, Insight for Social Scientists is a very short piece. It's very easy to read. He's going to list a whole bunch of ideas of what nonviolent actions are and are not. I want you to focus in on that when you're writing your reading memo. And finally, it's about a few paragraphs long, is why you should never underestimate a bunch of well-organized teenage protesters. And I want you to focus in why are they the forefront of nonviolence and what do they do? So when you are writing your reading memo, I want you to consider those things as you are writing. Thank you for listening to the screencast. I look forward to seeing your answers in the Google Doc, and take care.